Welcome back to the deep dive, folks. You know how this works. We take a really deep dive into all sorts of fascinating topics. And today, we're going to be exploring something that, let's be honest, has always had a bit of a grip on the human imagination, a kind of fascination with the occult, with the supernatural.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how often these ideas get expressed, get kind of collected and crystallized in books. You've got your mystical grimoires, your ancient texts with secrets that, well, some people would say are just too dangerous to even read.
Right. And it's not just about the content. It's the whole aura surrounding these books, the stories, the legends. Makes you wonder what makes these ideas so powerful, so enduring.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to be digging into today. We're going to be taking a close look at a book called Magic and Mystery, a popular history of the supernatural, the occult, and the unseen forces that shape belief. It's by Alfred Thompson. And I know what you're thinking. Popular history. Sounds a bit dry, right?
Maybe a bit textbooky.
Yeah, but trust me on this one. It's actually a fascinating read. It was originally published in the late 19th century, but it was updated recently in 2023, so it's got a really interesting blend of historical perspective and some more modern insights.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what's the mission for today's deep dive? What are we hoping to uncover?
Well, what we're going to do is try to understand where these supernatural beliefs and practices come from, historically speaking. Like, what are their roots? And we're also going to trace how these ideas have evolved over time. And I think you'll be surprised to see how many of them are still around today, in different forms, of course.
So it's kind of like understanding the hidden history of our own beliefs, right? The things we might take for granted or find strange, we'll see them in a whole new light.
Exactly. And Thompson, right at the beginning of the book, he makes this point that's really key. He says that the foundation of all this magic and mystery, the bedrock, if you will, is superstition.
Superstition, huh? It's kind of like the seed that all these other beliefs grow from. I can see that. But what is it about superstition that makes it so powerful, so foundational?
Well, Thompson argues that it all boils down to two very basic human emotions: fear and hope. Fear of the unknown, fear of bad luck, fear of, what happens after we die, and then hope for good fortune, hope for protection, hope for answers to the big questions.
It's like superstition is this kind of coping mechanism, isn't it? A way to deal with the things we don't understand and can't control.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And what's interesting is that Thompson emphasizes how superstition isn't this one-size-fits-all kind of thing. It can vary so much depending on all sorts of factors.
Like what?
Well, he talks about climate, for example. Like, you can imagine how people living in a place with really unpredictable weather might develop different superstitions than people who live in a more stable environment.
Right. And then there's temperament too, right? Some people
Wow.
are just naturally more prone to superstitious thinking than others. And what about religion? Surely that plays a role.
Oh, absolutely. Different religions have their own sets of beliefs and practices that often border on the superstitious. And then there's your occupation. Like, a farmer might have superstitions about the harvest, a sailor about the sea.
Makes sense. So superstition is this really adaptable thing, constantly evolving to fit the specific anxieties and hopes of different groups of people.
And what's really fascinating is how Thompson connects all this to our growing understanding of, well, everything. As we've learned more about the world, especially through the development of evolutionary theory, the idea of the supernatural has shifted a bit. It's become less about something external, something revealed to us by, gods or spirits, and more about something that's a product of the human mind itself.
Wait, so you're saying that these beliefs are kind of hardwired into us, passed down from our ancestors?
That's the idea, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, these beliefs developed in a time when our ancestors were a lot more vulnerable. They didn't have the knowledge or the technology that we have today, so these beliefs might have actually helped them survive.
Okay, that's an interesting way to look at it. So it's not that these beliefs are necessarily true, but they might have been useful at some point in our history. And Thompson uses the example of Greek and Roman mythology to illustrate this, doesn't he? All those gods and goddesses, the Lares, the Penates.
Exactly. For the people of those times, those beings were very real, very present in their lives. They worshipped them, they made sacrifices to them, they built temples in their honor.
And then what happened? Did they just disappear?
Well, kind of. With the rise of Christianity, those ancient deities gradually faded from view. But what Thompson points out is that this didn't mean the end of superstition.
Ah, so it just morphed into something else.
Precisely. The old beliefs might have been suppressed, but they were replaced with new ones, maybe presented as more, legitimate, but still essentially superstitious at their core.
So it's like this game of whack-a-mole with superstition. You knock it down in one place and it pops up somewhere else.
That's a great analogy. And what's really striking is how many of these older beliefs are still around today, even in what we like to think of as our enlightened modern world.
Oh, I know what you mean. It's like we still have these little rituals and sayings that have been passed down for centuries, even though we might not even realize where they came from.
Right. Thompson lists a bunch of them, actually, like spilling salt and throwing a pinch over your left shoulder for good luck, or the whole thing about sitting 13 at a table being unlucky, and then you've got magpies, one for sorrow, two for joy, right?
Oh, yeah. And don't forget about a hare crossing your path. That's supposed to be bad luck, too. And cracking furniture, howling dogs. It's amazing how many of these little superstitions we still hold on to. It's like they're embedded in our culture.
And it's not just the specific beliefs, it's the whole way of thinking. Thompson makes this point that anything that remains unexplained is going to have a certain pull on us, a certain power to evoke both fascination and anxiety. And this is especially true in areas where science hasn't provided clear answers yet.
So it's like the gaps in our knowledge are where superstition thrives.
Exactly. And that leads us perfectly into our next topic, magic. Now, when I say magic, I'm not talking about pulling rabbits out of hats or sawing people in half. I'm talking about the role that magic, or what was perceived as magic, played in ancient societies, especially in relation to government and religion.
Right, like those mysterious figures, the magi, the soothsayers, the sorcerers, they must have wielded a lot of power and influence.
Oh, absolutely. Thompson explains that in ancient times, magic was often closely tied to what we would now call medicine. It worked by tapping into people's fears and hopes, using charms and things like that. And he also draws a parallel to faith healing.
So it's about the power of belief, the power of suggestion. But there was also real knowledge involved, wasn't there? Like the Arabian school of medicine, for example.
Yeah, the Arabian physicians were actually quite advanced for their time. They had a sophisticated understanding of herbal remedies and even the use of metals in medicine. But Thompson points out how this knowledge also fed into the development of alchemy in the Middle Ages.
Alchemy, huh? Now that's something that definitely captures the imagination. The quest to turn lead into gold, to find the elixir of life, to discover the secrets of the universe.
Exactly. And Thompson argues that ancient rulers often exploited these beliefs to legitimize their power. They claimed divine favor, presented themselves as chosen by the gods, and basically used magic as a tool of control.
It's like a kind of propaganda, right?
Yeah.
Using the supernatural to keep the people in line. And I guess the black art plays right into that, doesn't it? That whole idea of sorcery and pacts with the devil.
Yeah, that's definitely the darker side of magic. It was all about instilling fear, about making people believe that the magician had access to these dark forces that could be used against them. And Thompson notes how these early practitioners of magic were often quite clever. They used their knowledge of astronomy and meteorology to predict events like eclipses or storms, which, of course, made them seem like they had supernatural powers.
Right, it's like the classic illusionist's trick. Make people believe you can control things that you really can't. But what's interesting is that Thompson doesn't just dismiss all magic as trickery. He actually points out how some of these practices were based on a genuine understanding of scientific principles.
Oh, absolutely. He gives some great examples, like acoustics. He talks about how they used to imitate the sound of thunder in temples to create this awe-inspiring effect, or those so-called speaking statues, where they used clever arrangements of pipes and tubes to make it seem like the statue was talking.
Wow, that's pretty ingenious. And what about hydrostatics? I remember reading something about fountains that flowed with wine and water.
Yes. Thompson mentions a fountain on the island of Andros that was said to discharge wine for a week every year, and then water for the rest of the time. And then there were those springs of oil that appeared in Rome and self-filling urns at feasts. It's all about understanding the principles of fluid pressure and equilibrium.
So it's like they were using science to create these illusions of magic. And I bet there were some pretty impressive mechanical contraptions involved too, right?
Oh, definitely. Think about the Egyptian obelisks, those massive stone pillars they erected, or the way they moved those huge stones around to build their temples. And then there were those stories of people being miraculously transported, or floors that seemed to move on their own. It's all about hidden machinery and clever engineering.
And then you have optics, right? I'm sure they were doing some pretty cool things with mirrors and lenses.
Oh, absolutely. Thompson suggests that they were creating apparitions of their deities using simple optical principles, which is kind of like a precursor to the phantasmagoria shows that became popular later on.
It's amazing to think about how they were able to achieve all these effects without the technology we have today. And it really blurs the lines, doesn't it, between what we would call science and what they considered magic.
It does, and this is where Thompson introduces his middleman theory. It's this idea that there's always some kind of intermediary figure, some unseen entity working behind the scenes.
Like a devil, for example.
Exactly, or other spirits, demons, whatever. The idea is that events don't just happen randomly. There's always some kind of agent, some kind of force influencing things. And Thompson even quotes this old Spanish proverb, where the devil cannot go himself, he sends an old woman.
I like that. It's like, even if you don't see the devil directly, he's still pulling the strings somehow.
Okay.
So it's not just about the belief in magic or the supernatural. It's about the belief in these unseen agents that are supposedly controlling things.
Right. And what's interesting is that Thompson also talks about this cyclical nature of belief and skepticism. He says it's not this linear progression from superstition to enlightenment.
Huh.
Like even in periods of supposed rationality, credulity can still flourish.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like human nature to want to believe in something beyond ourselves, something bigger than ourselves. And I guess the form that belief takes can change over time, but the underlying need remains the same.
That's exactly what Thompson suggests. He points out that even in ancient Greece, when you had philosophers questioning traditional beliefs, popular fanaticism was still widespread. And then you had figures like Mesmer in France and the whole craze around animal magnetism. And in England, you had the Cock Lane ghost and the followers of Joanna Southcott.
And even more recent times, you have things like the Theosophist movement and spiritualism. It's like this urge to believe in something beyond the material world keeps popping up, no matter how much scientific progress we make.
Exactly. And he even talks about those modern thought readers, the people who claim to have psychic abilities. They often find followers among people who are actually quite skeptical of traditional religion. So it's like this need for mystery, for something beyond the ordinary, is still there, even if the specific beliefs have changed.
Okay, so we've talked about superstition and magic. What about mystery? Thompson seems to suggest that we have this innate love for mysteries, for the unknown.
Oh, absolutely. And he talks about how this love of mystery can lead to what he calls extraordinary credulity, especially in matters that we don't fully understand.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, he talks about the ancient oracles, for instance. These were people who were believed to have the ability to communicate with the gods and predict the future. And then you had the mysteries of Eleusis and Isis, these secret rituals and ceremonies that were central to those ancient religions.
And of course, you can't forget about the Sphinx. That whole story is about the power of a riddle, the allure of the unknown.
Right. And Thompson points out how this fascination with mystery wasn't just an ancient thing. It continued into the Middle Ages, with all those secret passageways and castles, hidden symbols and paintings, and the use of cryptic language in writing.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like they were deliberately trying to create this sense of intrigue, this feeling that there was more to things than met the eye.
Exactly. And he even connects this to things like trial by ordeal and wagers of battle, where the outcome was seen as being determined by fate or divine intervention. And he sees a similar impulse in the development of folklore, those stories and legends that are passed down through generations.
So it's like this instinct for mystery is expressed in all sorts of different ways, from religion to architecture to storytelling.
Right. And Thompson seems particularly fascinated by the way this instinct played out in medieval Christianity. He talks about this curious mix of deep devotion and what might seem to us like a kind of playful irreverence.
Playful irreverence in relation to religion. How so?
Well, he mentions things like the Fête des Ânes, where they would bring a donkey into the church and kind of parody the sacred services. And then there were those frescoes in some of the older churches that depict scenes that would probably be considered quite shocking by today's standards.
Wow, that's pretty wild. And then there were those miracle plays, right? The ones that were often quite bawdy and irreverent, even though they were performed by people of high social standing.
Exactly. It's almost like there was this accepted space for exploring the mysteries of faith in ways that we might find quite strange today.
So it's not just about the belief in the supernatural. It's about the way the belief is expressed, the way it's woven into the fabric of everyday life.
Yeah, and that brings us to another fascinating aspect of this whole topic: the belief in invisible beings, the fairies and devils that populate the unseen realm.
Ah, yes, the creatures of folklore. From benevolent spirits to malevolent entities, it seems like every culture has its own version of these unseen beings.
And Thompson does a really good job of tracing how these beliefs evolved over time. You've got your ancient deities and demigods like the Roman Fates or the Persian Peri. And then in the Middle Ages, you have these more explicitly malevolent figures, like those malignant jays that he mentions.
And what about the Norse mythology?
Yeah.
All those elves and dwarves living underground. It's like every culture has its own version of this hidden world, this realm of the unseen.
Exactly. And Thompson brings up Plutarch, who observed that this belief in two opposing forces, good and evil, is pretty much universal. It's a duality that you find in all sorts of different cultures and religions.
And Christianity, of course, has its own version of this with the devil and his demons.
Right. And Thompson points out that these beliefs weren't just confined to ancient times. He emphasizes that belief in fairies and devils persisted in the British Isles relatively recently, even within the last couple of centuries.
Really? That's surprising.
Yeah.
I would have thought that those beliefs would have died out by then.
Well, apparently not. He talks about Scotland in particular, where the belief in the devil was quite strong. And there are all these stories about Satan appearing to people, playing tricks on them, tempting them.
It's like this idea of a personal devil, a devil that's actively involved in your life.
Exactly. And it's not just about devils and demons, of course. You have the fairies, too, those mischievous little creatures that are always up to something.
And then there were the water elementals, right?
Right.
Mermaids, mermen, those kinds of things. It's like every element has its own set of unseen inhabitants.
Right. And then Thompson talks about the Rosicrucians, this esoteric group that had a slightly different take on these invisible beings. They believed in elementals too, but they saw them as more like angels than demons, like the sylphs of the air, the salamanders of fire, the nymphs of the water.
So it's a more benevolent view of the unseen world.
Yeah.
But even with these more friendly elementals, Thompson still brings up that middleman problem. If these beings are real, why is it so difficult to communicate with them directly?
Exactly. He argues that once you start attributing ordinary events to the actions of invisible agents, then the perceived power of those agents can become limitless. Like anything could be explained as the work of fairies or demons or whatever.
So it's like a slippery slope. You start with a few unexplained events, and pretty soon you got a whole elaborate mythology of unseen beings controlling everything.
That's right. And then finally, Thompson explores this really fascinating intersection of faith healing and medicine. He points out that, historically speaking, disease was often seen as having a supernatural origin.
Which makes sense, right? If you don't understand what causes disease, it's natural to assume that it's the work of some kind of spirit or demon.
Exactly. And this led to all sorts of practices that we would consider quite strange today, like using charms and amulets to ward off illness or performing rituals to appease the spirits.
What about those wise women who were believed to have healing powers?
Oh yeah, Thompson talks about them too. He mentions that even Henry VIII passed an act to protect these women, who were often accused of witchcraft. And there were all sorts of strange cures that people believed in, like touching a tumor with a dead man's hand to make it disappear, or wearing a chip of wood from a hangman's gallows to protect yourself from fever.
It's hard to believe that people actually believed in those things.
Yeah.
But I guess when you're desperate for a cure, you'll try anything.
That's true. And Thompson notes that even learned men of the time often subscribed to these beliefs, like Lord Bacon believed that precious stones could cure diseases, and Sir Thomas Browne believed in the power of witchcraft for healing.
Wow, so these beliefs were pretty widespread. And Thompson mentioned some really outlandish remedies from that era, like distilling a 9-day-old pig with herbs as a treatment, or the belief that comets could cause epidemics.
Yeah, it's amazing the things people used to believe. And then there's the whole practice of healing by the royal touch. Thousands of people were supposedly cured by the touch of monarchs like Charles II, although later monarchs like William III were a bit more skeptical.
So it's like the belief in the power of the king was so strong that people actually thought he could heal them with a touch.
Exactly. And Thompson then goes on to discuss this more primitive understanding of disease, where it's linked to demons and spirits. He talks about the belief that animal or human souls could take up residence in objects and how this could cause illness.
It's like this idea that disease is caused by an imbalance in the spiritual realm.
Right. And he also highlights the importance of breath as the essence of life and the belief that when a person dies, their soul enters the atmosphere, which is a concept that he links to modern spiritualist beliefs.
So it's like these ancient ideas are still echoing in some of the beliefs we have today.
Exactly. And Thompson also explains how things like dreams and nervous disorders could lead to the idea of possession and the practices of sacrifice and exorcism. He links this to totemism and the belief in guardian demons.
So it's all about this interconnectedness between the physical and spiritual realms. And it wasn't just humans who were believed to have souls, was it?
No, not at all. Thompson points out that early beliefs extended the concept of a soul to animals, plants, inanimate objects, even celestial bodies.
So it's like this whole animistic worldview where everything is alive and imbued with some kind of spirit.
Exactly. And this led to all sorts of nature worship and the creation of anthropomorphic deities, gods and goddesses in human form.
It's like they were projecting human qualities onto the natural world.
Right. And this perceived connection between the cosmos and the individual also led to ideas like the rising of certain stars being linked to birth and the belief in a relationship between heavenly bodies and the human body, which, as Thompson points out, are ideas that foreshadow the development of alchemy and astrology.
So it's like these seemingly disparate ideas are all connected in some way. And then you have Paracelsus, who really tried to systematize all of this, right?
Yes, Paracelsus was this fascinating figure who developed the idea of the body as a microcosm, reflecting the larger macrocosm of the universe. And he saw disease as having a spiritual component, something that needed to be addressed on a spiritual level as well as a physical level.
And that's where we get the doctrine of signatures, right? The idea that the appearance of things can give us clues about their medicinal properties.
Exactly. Thompson gives all sorts of examples, like white substances being used for cooling, red substances for blood disorders, yellow substances for liver problems. And then you have specific plants that were believed to have healing properties based on their appearance. Like euphrasia, which has these little markings that look like pupils, was used for eye problems. And ginseng root, which kind of resembles a human figure, was used as a general tonic.
And walnuts, because they look like brains, were used for mental illnesses.
Right. It's really quite amazing the connections they drew. Like roses were associated with blood because of their color and the thorns, and plants that resembled the moon were believed to have special powers.
And the root of Solomon's seal, which has these little markings that look like a seal, was used for treating wounds. It's like they were looking for clues in the natural world, trying to decipher the language of nature.
And Thompson talks about the herbalist tradition, which was this blend of practical plant knowledge and an understanding of human credulity. He mentions Nicholas Culpeper, who was this famous herbalist who associated plants with white magic, suggesting that they had these inherent healing powers.
So it's like this fascinating mix of science and superstition. And Thompson doesn't shy away from the darker side of all this either. He acknowledges that poisoning was quite common in the Middle Ages, and that there was a lot of focus on deadly drugs.
Yeah, he even speculates about the lost secrets of ancient medicine, suggesting that there might have been knowledge that has been lost over time. But he also ends on a somewhat optimistic note, suggesting that there might be something to be learned from these ancient practices, even if we strip away the supernatural explanations.
Like what?
Well, he mentions things like electrotherapeutics and the use of color for treating nervous disorders. And he also points out that music has been used as a healing agent in many cultures, often based on the belief that it could drive away evil spirits.
So it's like some of these ancient ideas, even if they were based on superstition, might actually have a kernel of truth to them.
That's right. And it's something that modern science is starting to explore in new ways.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Alfred Thompson's magic and mystery, what are the key takeaways? What have we learned?
Well, I think one of the big things is the sheer persistence of superstition. It's been around for centuries, and it's still with us today, even if it takes on different forms.
Right. And then there's this fascinating entanglement of early scientific observation with magical belief. It's like they were trying to make sense of the world, but they didn't have the tools or the knowledge that we have today.
And then there's this timeless human fascination with mystery and the unseen realm. That seems to be something that's deeply ingrained in us, this desire to believe in something beyond what we can see and touch.
And finally, there's this long and complex history of how faith and medicine have interacted, how belief has shaped our understanding of health and illness.
And all of these historical perspectives, as Thompson presents them, give us a really valuable framework for understanding why we believe the things we believe and how those beliefs have shaped the world we live in.
And it leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it? Like, what does the persistence of these beliefs, even the ones that seem irrational to us now, tell us about the human mind? And what beliefs that we hold today might seem strange or superstitious to people in the future? It's definitely something worth pondering.
It is, and I think that's one of the great things about exploring these topics. It not only gives us a glimpse into the past, but it also makes us question our own assumptions about the world.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, isn't it? Challenging our perspectives, expanding our understanding, and maybe even having a little fun along the way.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us today, folks. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of ideas.